when engineers explain how something happens, they don't insert mystical steps or mystical causes. If you were the head engineer in charge of the space shuttle, for instance, and you know that one of the space shuttles broke up on re-entry into the atmosphere and all the astronauts died, but many other space shuttles made it through and landed fine. And if I was your boss and I were to say to you, Renee, tell me, why did that one space shuttle break up in the atmosphere, but the other one made it through? And if you as an engineer were to come to me and say, well, the atmosphere selected against that space shuttle, you would lose your job because engineers don't think like that. And so what engineering can bring to biology is the clarity that it would bring to the operation of space shuttles. It brings the precision of language and thought to biology that you find in every other area.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Creation Podcast, where we discuss the science that confirms Scripture. I'm your host, Renee, and you're listening to the third episode of a 4-part series on building a new theory. We're often told that science is objective, but if that's true, then how can two intelligent, rational people look at the same pieces of evidence and yet come up with completely different explanations? And not just different, but mutually exclusive. What causes this divide, and is there anything we can do about it? In the previous episodes, we looked not only at the power and purpose of theory, but we discussed how selectionism, the current reigning theory, is purposefully crafted to be anti-design. In this episode, we're going to take action in changing Darwinian thinking and reversing it to create a theory of biological design that actually works. Joining me again is ICR President, Dr. Renée Guliuzza. Dr. G, welcome back to the podcast.
Well, so good to be again with you, Renee. Thank you for all you're doing to prep these things.
Well, thank you. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today because really what ICR is doing is totally new in the realms of biology and just science in general. And we've looked at what a theory is, the purpose it serves, and how it can be influential, not just in science, but in our worldview. We've also looked at how selectionism is purposely designed to be anti-design, if you will. And today, we're actually going to turn evolutionary thinking on its head to create a whole new theory of biological design, which is really exciting. But before we do that, I would love to actually look back a little bit on how we got here, not just simply here in this room, but how Darwin got to the place of creating the evolutionary theory he created, and actually go back and look at the history of that. So as far as the history of evolution, what happened there? How did Darwin get to create a theory that was so influential today?
Well, you said it perfectly when you said he designed a theory to be anti-design. That indicates that it was purposeful, and it was purposeful in a way that was just the exact opposite of how people were thinking at the beginning. So how he got there is he was a good student. He was a good student of people who believed in intelligent design at the time, particularly William Paley. In fact, he said he had almost memorized all of Paley's work. So he knew Paley's main arguments. He knew the concepts that Paley was referring to. He knew his reasoning. And when he went to build his theory, he could take those main concepts of Paley and just invert the cause. He doesn't always dispute by any means Paley's observations. So Paley observed that organisms looked exquisitely designed, and therefore he believed that there was a designer who did that. Darwin could have taken the tack and said, no, organisms, they don't look designed at all. They look pretty shoddy. They look like they're just cobbled together and things like that, which some evolutionists do today. But Darwin thought that was foolish because people look at creatures, they look incredibly designed. And two, to say something is broken or doesn't have a function, that leaves you to be made foolish when future research shows that it isn't broken or there was a purpose for it. Mm-hmm. So he just said, I'll concede. Creatures do look incredibly designed, but I'll come up with another mechanism to explain that origin, and it'll be like the exact opposite of what you're saying. So you think things were done purposefully? I'm going to argue that they were done randomly. Mm-hmm. And he built this whole theory of explaining why creatures look so incredibly engineered, but without the need of an engineer.
Wow. And that's really sneaky because I feel like a lot of people will say, well, evolutionists believe that, there is no sign of design in creatures. And there are some, as you mentioned in your article, that believe that, we actually don't see design in creatures because they're just haphazardly put together. There are organs that aren't supposed to be there. But really, Darwin understood that, no, we're seeing design, but he completely flipped it on its head. And I think that's news for a lot of people. And actually, Stephen Jay Gould, who I know you're very familiar with, he was the leading evolutionary theorist of his time, Harvard biologist, and he says that Darwin holds that this order, the very basis of Paley's inference about the nature of God, arises as a side consequence of a causal principle of entirely opposite import. Can any argument be more subversive? One accepts the conventional observation, but then offers an explanation that not only inverts orthodoxy, but seems to mock the standard interpretation. This more radical version lies at the core of Darwin's argument for natural selection. So he's even acknowledging that Darwin really did understand the arguments for design.
You're exactly right. And he inverted the cause, just as Gould points out there, not just the cause of how it's happening, but even the underlying premise. And so before Darwin, when people would look at creatures, they would see birds fitting in the air, and they would also see organisms working together very, very well. And they thought that this was evidence not only of a God who was omniscient and powerful, but they thought it was evidence of a God who was loving and caring and providentially took care of his creatures either directly or set up processes which would do that for him in those areas. So they saw good things about their creator. And Darwin came along and said, well, that design not only is not done by God, it can be done by random natural processes. He said, but it's really not showing goodness either, because in order for organisms to advance, they have to do it at the expense of other organisms. That one group has to drive another group into extinction. And as he ends his book, with describing the war of nature, and one group dominating over another group. He said, so, it's really not the outworking of a good, loving God. It's just the outworking of the selfish self-expression of one creature at the expense of another. And so there isn't even really any goodness that you can actually see in nature itself. So he's pushing back the creation, but he's also mocking, as Gould says, this whole idea that you can even see the hand of a good, loving God.
Absolutely. We know, of course, Scripture says about people who mock God that God will not be mocked and he will not tolerate that. And, it's really interesting because, we see a lot of positive evidence for design. And we see, of course, even evolutionists admitting that creatures look engineered. And so if even evolutionists admit that we see this design in creatures, why isn't this enough? Why do we need a theory to actually establish the engineering of the organisms we see?
We need more than just negative evidence, as we discussed in one of our earlier podcasts. In other words, pointing out all the problems with evolutionary theory and all the predictions that they made that have been proven wrong, of vestigial organs that didn't turn out to be vestigial, and things like that, where they're just easy to knock out all of these outrageous claims that evolutionists have made that have been proven totally wrong. So negative evidence is good, but it doesn't dislodge the theory, obviously, because it's still here. So then some people think, well, why don't we just find the positive evidences? You look at how you need all these elements in a system together at the right place, at the right time, in the right amount in order for it to work. And there's no way it's going to come about through a slow, iterative process. That's called irreducible complexity. Maybe that's a good positive evidence, and that will affirm people to believe in intelligent design. Or you need things to be specified in the right amount that can't happen by chance or by natural laws. And maybe that's a good evidence for design, or just the sheer complexity that we see in creatures, an eye and all of the systems. Well, that doesn't dislodge evolutionary theory either. That's not super effective, because Darwin came up with a mechanism, the natural selector, which acts like an agent, which, as some evolutionists have said, can see the best traits, select the best traits, save the best traits, and build with the best traits. So when you have a mechanism when you have a view or a concept which can act like a real designer, the natural selector, well, then there's nothing too complex for it to actually accomplish. So they would say, sure, that it is incredibly complex, but given the power of the force of natural selection and coupled with the time to do it, nothing is impossible for that to overcome. And it may be cobbled together initially, but over a long period of time, it's going to be incredibly refined by this constant struggle to survive, to where you will end up with almost perfect organs in organisms.
So somehow you're getting perfection out of these imperfect processes, which, sounds crazy whenever you say that, as you've eloquently described, whenever you describe how it's a death-driven process that somehow is creating these beautiful traits in creatures, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And yet we've allowed this to infiltrate our society for so long. But you said in your most recent article that even counterintuitive theories that can barely tread water scientifically will continue to do so until an alternative theory arises. And so that's exactly what we're doing. We're building that alternate theory. And so transitioning now into what a theory of biological design actually does, would you be able to explain the purpose of what we're accomplishing in creating this new theory?
Well, the theory, as we discussed earlier, is a narrative. It's an explanatory narrative that hopefully has the force of some scientific observations behind it to make it robust, to make it valuable in interpreting what we see, to give us the ability to make predictions and hypotheses and run tests. That's what a theory is supposed to do. It's not just a guess. So it's supposed to have some scientific backing behind it. But all theories aren't just narratives. They're a way of looking at the world, they're a way of understanding things and thinking about them. They're like the filters that we see, or as we said in one of our earlier ones, the cubby holes that we put labels on in our mind that we interpret the world around us there. And they're always based on assumptions. There are some certain assumptions about the world, and we could go into whole additional podcasts about all of the assumptions of materialism and things like this. So let's just focus in on some assumptions of a theory of biological design. And one assumption will be that the engineering process is not just good in biology for developing applications. And applications, I mean, you discover something in biology and you find a way to turn it into technology. You find it in a way to develop some biomechanical thing which it's used for a lot. And so people generally think engineering is good. It's good for the applications. But pure biologists, they're the ones who do the basic research of understanding how biology operates. Well, that's really a myth. And it's been a myth for a long time for one reason. Biologists themselves, who are not engineers, a lot of them do a lot of applications. And you don't have to be an engineer to come up with biological applications. And vice versa, you don't have to be a molecular biologist per se to do basic biological research. A lot of engineers do basic biological research, and they're forced to because they want to come up with applications. So they're driven to do some basic biological research. So engineers and biologists are both doing applications, and they're both doing basic biological research. And I would suggest that research, regardless of whether it's for applications or the basic stuff, it all can come under the realm of engineering. All of it. In other words, biology, this is a radically new way of thinking about it. Biology is like a discipline of engineering. And I'm talking about studying biological functions.
Which I think is a completely new perspective for a lot of people. And even I think you've mentioned before that, as far as the secular models in geology or other fields of science, just taking geology, for instance, we have the flood model that, counters a lot of the secular thinking in that area, but there's really nothing in biology as far as a theory at the moment that would be able to counter the Darwinian thinking that we see. And this engineering theory of design is really turning it on its head, which is so exciting. And so as far as the tenets of a theory of biological design, what would you say are the major tenets of this new theory?
Well, there's the one that we were just discussing, which is like a tenet is almost an assumption of this, that both basic research and applications fall within the realm of engineering. And when you think about it, biologists have been engineers from the beginning. They don't see themselves as engineers because all of them may not be doing applications, and therefore they're equating engineering with applications. But what they are actually doing when they study living things is they're methodically taking them apart, piece by piece. And it starts at the organism level, and they start to go into the systems of those organisms, and they take the systems apart, and they find the elements, and then they can take those elements apart, and they find the basic components of the elements, all the way down to the molecular level. So as biologists have been doing this now for decades, taking organisms apart piece by piece, very methodically, and figuring out what each piece does and how they all fit together, there's a name for that. And that's called reverse engineering. And so biologists have been and will continue to be reverse engineers right from the very beginning. And they're doing the exact same thing with someone who wants to steal an idea from another company. And so therefore they buy their product and they start to take it apart to figure out how it works so that they can copy it or try to copy it in some way on that. And so that's what reverse engineering is in the industrial realm. It's you take things apart. If you didn't build them yourself, you take them apart to figure out how they were built and what the thinking of them was to build them. That's what biologists have been doing. And the fact that they can do it, and they can do it so methodically, and when they take them apart, they can actually reassemble things back together, is strong evidence that these organisms are not cobbled together. They're not the product of tinkering, that they are the product of engineering. And therefore, you can do that. I mean, there is a hope for biomechanical engineers to build robotic things, to build robotic hands for people who've lost a hand, for instance, that can be controlled by their thoughts, and that they will be able to move that, and that they'll be able to put sensors in the fingers of that robotic hands that they'll be able to sense in their own brain and in their own mind. So these things can be fit together. There's a hope that we'll be able to make a type of synthetic blood for people who need a transfusion rapidly and there isn't enough blood supply, that you can build a type of synthetic blood that will keep them alive, so that you can engineer things that can be used in creatures. So it's very reasonable to conclude that these creatures were highly engineered.
Yeah, and as we talked about in a previous episode, even looking at the example of birds and airplanes, and we see an airplane and that can be taken apart. We can separate it into its parts and know, well, this didn't haphazardly come together. And it's the same thing with birds. It's the same thing with any other organism, from which we get inspiration to create our own prosthetic, human parts or whatever we're building. We can clearly see the design in those robotic features and how much more in those creatures themselves. And so it's really interesting to know that even evolutionists acknowledge that. And yet here we are having to create a new theory because they just are so stubborn about what they believe in evolution.
Yeah, and that's a great segue to another major tenet of biology, is that, when you look at wings on an airplane, you look at wings on a bird, they operate by the same engineering principles. And they function according to natural laws the same way, and they operate by the exact same engineering principles. So a major tenet of a theory of biological design doesn't conclude that the best explanation for the design we see in creatures is due to an intelligent designer. It hypothesizes, which is very different. I hypothesize that the reason why organisms look so highly engineered is because they are highly engineered. So this would be something I could test. I'm not drawing it as a conclusion. I'm holding it up as a test. I think they look engineered. Therefore, I'm going to look for tests for the engineers, for engineering principles behind them, and therefore I'm going to assume that the best explanation for how their biological functions operate is going to be due to engineering principles. And I'm going to assume that you can only really come to correct cause and effect explanations. In other words, your causes. You can only come to correct causes if you explain the operation by engineering principles. And I'm going to assume the moment you get out of the realm of engineering, of course this could be proved wrong, that you're going to be off on the wrong course towards explanations. You're going to be dabbling in something which we're going to get to in a second of just called mysticism, but that my assumption that they look engineered because they are, my hypothesis, I can test that. And I'm going to assume that, unless proven otherwise, engineering principles will be absolutely necessary to come up with correct scientific explanations for the operations of biological functions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you even mentioned in this third article as well that from there you're able to make predictions about what creatures are going to do moving forward because of those engineering principles, that we can have explanations for why they do what they do and then also know how they're going to respond to stimuli moving forward. And so with that, we've talked about, of course, the need for a theory of biological design. We've talked about how Darwin knew the design playbook and he was able to invert it or try to invert it to create his theory of evolution. So now I'd love to transition to the primary goal of this theory. Would you be able to expand on that a little bit?
Well, the goal we need to do is reverse some basic tenets that Darwinists advanced. And they have a lot. But in my article, I had to limit it to just 5. I had to kind of like pick the 5 biggest ones that I thought need to be reversed. So the thinking is this. People before Darwin held that organisms look engineered because they were engineered, and they had some concepts. Darwin knew what those concepts were. He built an alternative theory which reversed the explanation for most of those concepts. And now, to get back, the future is back in the way. The future is to go back and reverse the things that Darwin reversed back to how they were prior to Darwin and built on what we now know subsequent to Darwin for those things. So prior to Darwin and what we now know, we can add additionally after Darwin. So we need to go through, and at least 5 of these, we need to flip them on their head.
Yes, absolutely. Well, let's dive right into those steps. The first one I have is reverse life emerges from biological operations to life is what enables ongoing biological operations. And so how is this concept of life related to biology?
Well, what we need to do right off at the bat is kind of define, when we're talking about a theory of biological design, and I'm arguing that biology is a realm of engineering, we need to answer the objection that's going to pop up right away. But wait a second here. This table isn't alive, but you are alive. There's something fundamentally different about you than this table. And what's different about you is that you have life, and you have consciousness, and you have volition, and you have these things which are really, really hard to describe and to define. And so evolutionists, because of their worldview, they say that, well, life, this consciousness that you have, it's just an emergent property. It just emerges from the operation of your neurons in your brain. Your consciousness arises from that in some way. Yeah, it's
that doesn't really make sense.
It doesn't, and not only does it not make sense, it's really, really hard, and it's very, very difficult to demonstrate scientifically. So it boils down to a belief. And not just your consciousness arises from your neurons, but you, this life, arises somehow from the operation of all of your biological functions. And we would argue wrong, totally wrong on both accounts. And this theory of biological design isn't even dealing with life. We would argue, 1, you can't demonstrate that life arises from the operation of biological principles. In fact, we would say you can't even really measure life. So if I were to say, Renee, hand me a beaker of life.
Be awfully hard.
It'd be awfully hard because nobody can hand me a beaker of life. Hand me a cubic foot of life. Give me a cup of your thoughts. These things can't be quantified like this. And in fact, we've had this whole conversation with the people listening to this podcast, and we've taken thoughts from our mind, developed them, spoken them, gone out over the airways. People have heard them, and they've come back to their mind. And so we've transferred thought to thought in someone's mind, but their mind hasn't gotten any heavier. You can't weigh it now after we've spoken to them, and it's like, oh, here's some more thoughts. Here's some more information. Because as far as we know, your thoughts is immaterial. Your life is immaterial. So when we're talking about a theory of biological design, and this is very important, even for creationists who are listening to us, we are not talking, I'm pounding this down, we are not talking about life itself. I'm not saying that consciousness will be explained by engineering principles. I'm not saying that life will be explained by engineering principles. And I'm also saying that consciousness and life are not explained by biological functions. What I am saying is that the biological functions of growth, reproduction, adaptation, metabolism, things that all creatures do, those functions will be best explained. How those functions work will be best explained by engineering principles and not my consciousness and not my life. As far as I know, that is immaterial. Nobody's going to be explaining it. Nobody's going to be testing. The real Renée is not a product of your biological functions. The real Renée is immaterial. And when your biological functions cease, you don't cease. Renée doesn't cease. Renée continues. Your body stops. Your link to this world through your physical body is broken. But the real Renée keeps on going.
Wow. And if that doesn't point to creator, I mean, because there's that element of, what we can see and what we know about biology, and yet there's still this part of us that is eternal. And of course, we read about that in God's word in Ecclesiastes, that there's eternity in our hearts. We know that there's more beyond this, beyond just what's physically here and what we can study. And so as far as this reversion goes, how does this influence how we do research as well as how we interpret that research?
Well, it points out that you're kind of foolish, or it's going to be fruitless to try to study chemistry and believe that you're going to create life, or that you're going to explain life due to the basic laws of chemistry or physics or those kinds of things. It's just not going to pop out of that whatsoever. And two, in terms of a theory of biological design, everybody should know that we're here to explain the material operation of your biological functions. We want to frame how you take resources from your environment and use them to build up a body. That can be explained by engineering principles. We want to explain how you gather resources from your environment and you convert those to energy. Those can be explained by engineering principles. We want to look at how you adapt to different things in your environment. That can be explained by engineering principles. And even conceptually, you could explain a creature being able to take in enough resources and have enough programming that it could even make a copy of itself. It could even reproduce. It could produce a copy of itself, and that thing could produce a copy of itself. From a physical standpoint, that's not conceptually out of the question. We could conceive of doing it. It would be an incredibly complicated, well-engineered machine to be able to do such a thing like that. But it can be explained by engineering principles. So we're saying, one, organisms don't get their life from their own biological functions. Organisms don't get life from engineering principles. It's separate from them. Two, we're saying organisms are not machines. Because even if we could build a machine that could reproduce itself and could grow, there would still be something fundamentally different about the machine that you and I built that could do that than your dog. Your dog has life. This machine, even though it could reproduce, does not have life. So we're saying, don't look to creatures as machines, but don't look to the principles to explain it. Life is an immaterial thing. It's not going to be explained through scientific research on this planet, but how their biological functions operate, focusing on that. I hope I've made this very clear. That can be explained by engineering principles.
Absolutely. And I think that's such an important point, just as far as, there is something fundamentally different about, our dogs that we know and love and have life in them versus like if we were to make a robotic version of those, we know that doesn't have that aspect of life that only can be made by a creator. And so with our second point, I have here reverse. Nature is like a human breeder who favors selected entities. To engineering causality eliminates mystical steps and causal explanations. I know you've already mentioned a little bit about that mysticism behind evolution. So would you be able to expand on that a little bit?
This is really, really important. It's probably one of the hardest ones for people to kind of flip in their mind, but it's vitally important. Darwin needed an agent. When you look at creatures, it looks like they are the product of an agent, their design. You look at this table, like here's an agent built this thing, it's got purpose, it's got function. And creatures look that way as well. In addition to that, creatures exercise agency. Your dog exercises agency. Your dog wants to do things. Your dog wants to go when you say, do you want to go? It has agency. So you have organisms with agency that look like they were built by an agent. So this whole idea of agency in some way needs to be addressed. Darwin did it very cleverly by projecting, and you'll have to go back to our previous podcast to get an in-depth explanation of this, by projecting onto nature a type of agency. He projected on it the ability to select. And when he does that, he projects onto it intelligence and volition. So he has a type of agency which is operative, and as we said already, that can see, select, save, and build creatures in time. So evolutionists, they have this worldview where nature operates as an agent. And in their mind, they're envisioning all kinds of real operating things, but they're only happening in their mind, and they inject a lot of mystical concepts into biology. Mystical concept one is that nature can select. It's totally mystical. Nature doesn't have a brain. Nature is full of living things, but it's not alive. And some people believe it is, of course.
There's no Mother Nature.
There's no Mother Nature, though, of course, some people would argue with us on that. Well, nature, they would say, does have a type of life quality to it. And they would argue that it does operate as if it's alive. But we know that that nature isn't alive. It isn't thinking. It isn't operating. So to project selective abilities onto it in any way is mystical. But that ability to act, see, select, and save is fundamental to the operation of evolutionary thinking. They think that certain traits are selected for, though evolutionists argue a lot over what the unit of selection is. Is it a population? Is it an individual organism? Is it the genes? Is it whatever it is? Can systems be selected? So the reason why they argue over what's being selected is because nothing is being selected. There is no selection event. And there's another one, unobserved selection events, unidentifiable units of selection. Their view sees forces of nature driving creatures along through time, and they're called selective pressures. But that's just another concept which exists in their mind because nobody can quantify a selection pressure. And they see a war of nature. They see a constant struggle of creature struggling against creature, and competition of one eliminating another on that. But this competition, this war of nature, it's only existing in their minds. When you look at the world around you, you're not seeing a war of nature. Sure, you see animals will eat another animal, but you're not seeing unrelenting competition. And in fact, when you actually study ecosystems and how organisms are really working together, you see a lot of cooperative relationships. You see a lot of beneficial things where one organism provides a product to another and vice versa. You see things working together. So they envision, because they need it for their concept to work, this competition, this extinction, this struggle for life, and along with their selection pressures, their selection events, they envision all of this stuff. And once they envision it, they write it up in their scientific papers as if they were really real. They write the competition drove out this creature, even though they don't know that. They write about this war in nature, even though it can't be demonstrated. They write that certain genetic changes were random mutations, even though they can't demonstrate that they were random at all. But in their mind, it's as real can be that this was random. This competition is real. And so they write their papers as if these are real, observable things when no one's ever identified selection, what's being selected, or seen a selection event, or quantified a selection pressure. None of these things are real. And so engineering will help liberate biology from that.
Wow. And that's so crazy to think that these are all mystical elements that these evolutionists are envisioning, and yet they end up in our textbooks. They end up in our conversations and in our worldview ultimately.
As real things.
Yeah.
They end up as real things. And what's valuable about engineering is when engineers explain how something happens, they don't insert mystical steps or mystical causes. They don't insert these things. Everything is very objective and precise. So if you were the head engineer in charge of the space shuttle, for instance, and you know that one of the space shuttles broke up on reentry into the atmosphere and all the astronauts died, but many other space shuttles made it through and landed fine. And if I was your boss and I were to say to you, Renee, tell me, why did that one space shuttle break up in the atmosphere, but the other one made it through? And if you as an engineer were to come to me and say, well, the atmosphere selected against that space shuttle, or that space shuttle wasn't favored, you would lose your job because engineers don't think like that. But biologists say selected against, selected for, and that pretty much ends their explanation. It's over. But engineers don't put in magical selection events. They don't see environments as favoring or disfavoring. Environmental conditions are what they are. And as an engineer, what you would do is you would look to that space shuttle. You would find out what was wrong with that space shuttle. Oh, in this case, a tile came off. Why did the tile come off? And you would start digging down to all of the problems of what led that space shuttle to fail, and they would all be real. They'd all be identifiable. They'd all be tangible. You would have no magical selection events. You would not appealing to any selective pressures by the atmosphere. You would not be referring to any magical things. And so what engineering can bring to biology is the clarity that it would bring to the operation of space shuttles. It brings the precision of language and thought to biology that you find in every other area.
I love that space shuttle analogy because I think it can be so easy for a lot of people, even Christians, to say, well, natural selection makes sense, survival of the fittest, all of that. But then whenever you put it in those terms, you realize just how crazy that sounds.
Right.
Like, of course, it's not the atmosphere that's breaking this space shuttle apart. And so I think that's a really important point there. And so even with this third point that we have, as far as just the purposefulness of design and what we see in creatures, I have reverse pointless random genetic mutations, purposeful goal-oriented actions indicative of top-down planning. So can you describe a little bit about the purpose that we are putting back into this theory of biological design?
Sure. Let me explain what you just mentioned there about top-down planning. Top-down planning, and that's a phrase that engineers use. So if we were the engineers and we were tasked to build something, we would first ask, well, what do you want it to do? We would ask, what's its purpose? What do you want this system to do? What do you want this thing to do? And we would be asking about the purpose, because in engineering, purpose always drives the design. And designs are meant to fulfill a particular purpose. So purpose and design go hand in hand. They work with each other. So we're going to be asking the purpose. So top-down starts with the purpose. What do we want it to do? And then we start identifying all the capabilities that it's going to have and all of the features that it's going to have in order to make it work, to fulfill that purpose. And it'll get more subdivided, and that's top-down planning. You let the purpose drive it. Evolutionists see life the exact opposite. They see it as bottom-up. They see no purpose in anything. There was no overriding goal. There was no purpose for how anything happened. It just functions. And so when two things happen to work and they enable it to survive better, it functions. But it wasn't created for a purpose. It just functions, enabling you to survive better. And then the next thing that happens to come along that could be built onto it happens to enable it to survive better. And so their view is bottom up. No goal, no purpose, nothing there. It's all being built from the bottom up there. And of course, that doesn't make much sense either. But if your view is to explain things without a designer, then you're forced to see things as being built from the bottom up and not top down. And so they're bottom up assumptions, they're bottom up beliefs, which are going to exclude purpose altogether, excludes the whole idea of an intentionality. Therefore, when an environment changes and an organism changes, and let's say they can identify a change in the DNA, that's all there is, that you've just identified a change in the DNA. You could call that a genetic change, but their worldview, their way of looking at things, constrains them to identify it as a mistake. They would call it a random mutation. And they're going to say, well, it's a copying error. It's going to be something that was introduced by the environment, which broke the DNA. Because genetic changes that would happen toward a particular end would sound very purposeful, and that would sound very designed. And so even though all you have is a genetic change, and there's no reason why you have to characterize it in one way or another, they're forced to characterize it as a random, broken thing, because in their worldview, it's bottom up. We're saying, let's dump that thinking.
Yeah, and I think that is such an important point, because I've heard even in Christian circles, a lot of people saying, well, God directs those mutations. Well, what if it's a genetic change that God purposely programmed into these organisms, like you were saying, to allow them to adapt, not simply a random, pointless happening that is somehow shaping these organisms into more highly evolved creatures. And I think that's such an important takeaway. And so with that kind of leads into our fourth point, reverse passive organisms shaped by active external conditions to active organisms engineered with the innate capacity to shape themselves. So would you be able to expand a little bit on that point as far as how creatures are adapting?
Yes, it builds on the last thing that we were talking about. And, when you were just talking about how maybe God, when he was designing creatures, what if he built into them mechanisms that could actually change DNA on purpose and purposefully and for a direction on that? What if he built those things in? What if he built epigenetic mechanisms? What if he built, and this is, I think it's mostly there, and I think research is going to bear this out, what if he built mechanisms that were able to take information that organisms sense from their environment and bring it in and lead to the purposeful change of DNA and those kinds of things, which would lead to purposeful changes of their traits along those lines? What if that is actually there? What if that's just one of many ways which the Lord has built into creatures which allow for purposeful or directional change rather than random change? And so evolutionists, because they see things as purposeless and from the bottom up, therefore, as organisms relate to their environment, they will hedge on the side of the environment driving organisms through time, driving changes of the traits of organisms through time. Organisms relate to the environment. So when the environment changes and an organism changes, they see the environment as driving that. That is something really new that Darwin introduced, and we talked about it our last podcast called externalism. And Stephen Jay Gould mentioned that Darwin was the first to see this externalistic view. Well, not just Stephen Jay Gould, but other researchers have obviously embraced Darwin's externalism, and therefore they see organisms primarily as modeling clay over time. And the environment is molding and shaping and crafting organisms. And organisms are relatively passive in this view of things. So the externalistic view sees the environment shaping a population of organisms and driving it through time. So now that people are listening to our podcast, I will be challenging them. As you read scientific papers, as you read headlines, look for the words like climate drives a population of organisms, geology drives things, geology shapes, and geology will mold these things. You'll begin to see this operative view that nature is the driving factor on that. And we're saying that's totally wrong. Totally wrong. Engineers build things. The operative end is in the thing you built. So if you want that space shuttle to go through the atmosphere, the operative end isn't the atmosphere. It's the features that you build into the thing. That's what you can change. If the space shuttle breaks, that's what you will modify. That's what you will fix. Everything engineers know is that what we build into the entity, and any capabilities that the entity we will ever have, that we build into it. Even the capability to learn, like an artificial intelligence, we build that capability into it up front. And if you don't build the capability in, it will never have that capability. So you must always focus on the organism. And so as organisms relate to their environment, when the environment changes, maybe there's enough variability within this population that they can change and solve that problem themselves. Or maybe two, there's a way for them to modify and express their traits differently that will solve that problem. And we can give dozens of examples of how this happens. So rather than seeing organisms as being driven passively, maybe organisms are driving themselves. Maybe organisms are solving those problems, and we should see the challenges in an environment as being solved by the organisms. Organisms solve those problems one way or another. There's many ways they can solve them, but they will solve those problems. And when they solve those problems, they're enabled to live in that niche. And so because the Lord gives organisms this problem-solving ability, they're able to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth with that ability. And so just like in an engineering company where someone has a problem and engineers come up with solutions, potential solutions to solve that problem, maybe 5 engineers come up with 5 different potential solutions. One of them solves it better than the others. One, nobody would ever say the problem selected that solution.
Yeah.
They wouldn't say the problem selected the solution. That, from an engineering standpoint, that makes no sense. It shouldn't make any sense in biology. It's silly. You would say this solution successfully solved the problem. And if it was the best solution, then you would expect it to become the dominant solution within that company, and maybe other companies. They would take over the population as the best solution to that problem. Either way, it's this thing, it's this ability of the entity to solve the problems, which is what you need to focus on. Active problem-solving creatures, which can take on challenges, solve those challenges, and fill those niches. Complete opposite of seeing passive modeling clay being shaped by the environment.
Complete opposite, as we were saying earlier, of the Mother Nature that supposedly has godlike agency over these creatures versus, an infinitely intelligent designer who's able to shape these creatures to respond to what's around them. And how gracious of our Creator to do that.
And there's another thing which we really have to emphasize for the listeners. It's really important. Organisms relate to their environment. So as you mentioned, they respond to stimuli. That's something that we really need to just explain here very, very quickly. So you have an environmental condition, and it's a stimulus for this organism. You say, well, this environment stimulated the organism. Isn't it driving it? No. And we need to understand what and why something is a stimulus when it's in the environment. So all of the people who are listening to this podcast right now are being bombarded by AM radio waves. I am, everybody who's there, because they're just pervasive. But nobody here, at least I hope not, is hearing AM radio in their head. That's because even though you're being bombarded by the radio waves, they're not a stimulus. Therefore, not everything in your environment is a stimulus to you. In fact, most things in your environment, most conditions in your environment are not a stimulus or a cue or a driver or whatever word you want to use. They're not that. Why aren't they? That's because for something to be a stimulus, the engineer must specify the condition to be a stimulus. Conditions just aren't stimulus. The entity defines for itself what will be its stimulus.
Wow.
And it defines, light will be a stimulus. And how does it define it? One, it will have a sensor for light. And two, it will have programming to do something with that light once it is detective so that it can respond. So the engineer specifies for an entity. All entities specify for themselves what will be their stimuli and what won't be them and how they process it. Something in and of itself in the environment isn't a stimulus. It's always the entity which does it. And mere exposure to things doesn't make them stimuli. Mars and Earth are being bombarded by the same light from the sun. But as far as we know, on Mars, there's no stimuli. But on Earth, there are, because living things specify light to be a stimulus. And we could go on and on. Organisms specify what will be their favorable conditions. Organisms specify what is a stimulus. So it's clear, though you relate to your environment, you relate because your designer gave you the capability to do that and relate to it.
Wow. That is such a mindset shift, because I think for me, I've always pictured, well, the stimuli are what, they're what is causing the actual organism to change, versus the control is within the organism innately to be able to determine what it responds to and how it responds and turn to that. And
exactly.
I think that's going to be mind blowing for a lot of our listeners. I know it definitely is for me. And so that leads us into our last point: reverse mystical forces controlling interrelated biological operations to organisms are discrete operative elements of the whole ecosystem. So that relates to what we were just talking about, but taking it into the big picture of the ecosystem itself. So would you be able to just expand a little bit on that last point?
Right. This is an expansion. As I said, organisms relate to their environment, which means organisms relate to other organisms, and organisms relate to other conditions. And this is really a fascinating realm of research, because you have to look at it not from each individual organism perspective, but you study it from above. Like you're looking at from above, two organisms work together, and therefore you see, how they work together. But on an organism basis, these organisms may have no clue that they are actually working together by any means, or that they need this plant, or they need this sunlight, or they need this pollen. They don't know that. And so you only see how they work together by looking at it from what I would call the God's eye view. You look from above and you see dozens of things, and they all seem to be relating, of which none of them may know that individually that they're doing it. Wow. So every individual still is studied as that, an individual. Renée is an individual. Renée has a distinct boundary. I know where Renée stops and Renée begins. And so if we want to know how Renée works, we study Renée. And if we want to know how Renée relates to Randy, we have to come up and find out how that happens. How is it that Renée can relate to Randy? How is it Renée can relate to any other thing? And you must know from an engineering perspective that no two organisms in and of themselves will just automatically work together. You can't get two things to automatically cooperate with each other. You can't get two things to automatically function together. They have to be connected in some way, and engineers will design a way to connect them, which is an interface. An interface which has specific design elements to them. Protocols and a common medium and things like this, which are absolutely necessary for an interface to work. But unless you enable a way for these two organisms to relate, that is, either communicate or work together, they will never do it. You just can't say, now do it. You have to give each of them capabilities in order to do that. But they never lose their individual identity. They're still separate elements. And evolutionists lose sight of this, because two organisms can be engineered to work together incredibly close to what engineers might even call a seamless operation. And evolutionists sometimes say they're absorbed into the whole, or they become a supra-organism, or they're part of a collective on that. But that's not true. There's always a seam on that. You have these distinct separate enemy. You have these distinct separate elements, but they're working together as part of a larger system. And if you want to know how that works, you have to study each of these elements separately, and you have to study the interfaces which enable them to work together, some of which can be incredibly elaborate there. But what this is really pointing to is a mind which can understand almost everything about every creature, because engineers who build interfaces have to know how this creature operates, or this thing operates, and this. And they have to know how both of them operate so they can build something that can tie them together, that will let them to work together. So whoever built all of these ecosystems we see knows how this creature works, and knows how this creature works, and knows how this one, and this one, and this one, and this one, and has ways to tie them all together. It sounds like this person who built this knows everything about the whole system.
Yeah, I know. It sure sounds like it. And, it's interesting because as you're talking, I was thinking about the example you used in your article just with flowers and bees, and how evolutionists might say, well, flowers evolved this strategy for, luring bees to them, or however, that works. But actually the bees are the ones that are adapting and are able to track their environment. And so it's just interesting how the Lord has designed these creatures to work together, even whenever they may not consciously, of course, understand what's going on, or that they realize what's happening. And so I think that's such an important point you make.
Yeah, and don't you think that's kind of mystical on their part too? And, this is where engineering eliminates this mysticism. And I took that phrase right from from evolutionary literature. The flowers or the bees evolved a strategy too. On that. And that's because they're forced. They see that the bees and the flowers work together so well, but they're bottom up. Therefore, they have to believe they co-evolved with each other. And in their mind, that co-evolution is as real as sunrise. In their mind, those bees evolving a strategy to do something is as real as water. It's real to them. They see it, and it's in their mind. It's absolutely real, and they write it up in their papers as if it's absolutely real. But anybody, particularly coming from an engineering perspective, immediately spots, when you say they strategized to do this, you've just injected a mystical explanation, Mr. Evolutionist, into your causality, which is supposed to be completely non-mystical, because you're saying we're the mystical ones, but you inject these mystical selection events, mystical strategies, mystical competition. You inject all of this mystical co-evolution in there, which you can't demonstrate or prove on there. And so engineering will help to push all of this out, and you'll even be able to understand ecosystems better, because you'll see organisms as individual elements working together.
Wow. Well, we just covered a lot with even just those 5 points as far as, what we need to do in order to reverse Darwinian thinking in the field of biology. And so as far as ICR goes, we are starting to do quite a bit of research in pioneering this new theory. So I would love for you to just talk a little bit about what that looks like. What is ICR doing as we're beginning to create a brand new theory of biological design?
Well, we could have pioneered into a lot of areas, but one of the major icons of evolution is cavefish, the blind cavefish. It's used as an example of natural selection segregating out fish which had eyes and were living in rivers, segregating them through a trial and error process when they get swept into caves, to eventually they become hypopigmented and blind. And nobody's actually seen this happen. So this is a kind of a mystery. We just know that we have these fish that are pigmented and with eyes that have been streams, the cavefish. We know that they can mate together. We know they're the same species, but how did they get to that? How did they get to that state? And the evolutionary scenario is through trial and error, hit and miss, random genetic mutations, breaking the genes for the eyes, breaking the genes for the pigmentation and stuff like this, eventually segregating out and leading to these blind cavefish. Well, the whole story is pretty suspect. First of all the mystical things that are in it, like I just mentioned, that you can identify. In addition, these fish change in so many additional ways other than just eyes and pigmentation. Their metabolism changes, their blood cells change, how they handle oxygen and acidic conditions and low conductivity and how they eat and mate. I mean, there's just so many things that have to change for these fish to live in these caves that it kind of becomes completely unreasonable to think that random mutations are going to be making all these changes and doing it so quickly that they could actually live in these caves on that. So we predict that these fish were designed to live in caves when they need to colonize a cave. And therefore, we will predict that these eyes can be turned off purposely. We will predict that rather than having broken genes for pigmentation, for instance, that pigmentation could be a trait that can be modulated down if you're in a cave, and maybe modulated back up if you go from a cave back to a river. It's not due to broken genes. It's due to a modulatable process on that. That is a major difference in prediction. Broken genes, which I could show you in a half a dozen papers by evolutionists, that these genes, they say, were the target of evolution and they were broken on multiple occasions. And we would say, no, modulatable trait. Well, we can test that. You can take cavefish. You can put them back in simulated river conditions. If they've got broken genes, they're going to stay hypopigmented. If it's modulated, they'll regain their pigmentation. Well, in less than a month, these fish regain their pigmentation.
Wow.
They're as pigmented as a surface fish in less than a month. So clearly, these are not broken genes. Clearly, this is a process which can be turned up and turned down. Can you take a surface fish and have it lose its pigmentation? Yes. You can take the surface fish, you can put it in simulated cave water conditions, and within days, the pigmentation starts to go away. You can observe it. You can see it. We predicted this would happen. We predicted this would be modulatable. And we have other predictions for other traits as well. So one, for evolutionists say you don't do the research, you don't make predictions wrong. But what this is really demonstrating is the power of actually coming up with a theory. We're not just throwing stones at evolutionary theory. We said, we believe these fish do what they're doing because they were engineered to do that. We predict if we expose them to this will happen. We predict if we expose them to something different will happen. And you're able to test it. And that's just the beginning of the research that we're doing. People who are listening to the podcast will have to stay along with us. Keep listening. We'll give them updates on it. Keep reading Acts and Facts magazine. We will give you updates in Acts and Facts magazine on this research. But there's power in a theory to expose all the mysticism in evolutionary theory. There's power in a theory to set a research program where you can make predictions and actually test those.
Yeah, and what's so exciting is people can even come here and see our research for themselves. I mean, we have the cavefish right here in Dallas, and we're doing this research in real time, and it is a very exciting time to be at ICR and to be pioneering this new theory. Right. And so it has been a joy to get to talk about it with you today. And as we wrap up, I would just love to put it back to you as far as, is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to talk about a little bit more as we close?
Wow, after 3 podcasts, we have really covered a lot of material, and this one was even pretty dense. I hope we've explained it so everybody can understand it. Theory matters. The narrative matters. The way you view how creatures operate really matters. Listener, creationist, or ID advocate, it's not just enough to have evidence against evolution. It's not even enough to just have positive evidence for why things look designed or complicated, or some type of complicated specified complexity. It's not enough to have that. They have a mechanism which they believe can explain all of that. Mm. You need to replace the selectionist explanation, and there's power in an engineering-based, organism-focused theory of biological design. There's power in it to set a research agenda, as we just mentioned, and there's power in it to expose why evolutionary selectionism, why Darwinian selectionism is just a mystical mental construct. It is not a description of reality. It's a mental construct by which they interpret the world. It's their interpretive framework. In other words, it's just verbiage. Renee, it's just words. It's just verbiage that they use to interpret, and that they've invented a whole bevy of jargon and vocabulary that fits it. And once they put it together in their mind, it takes on a life of its own and it becomes real to them, and that's how they see it. It's very hard to just get rid of that by criticizing it. Replace it with something which explains cavefish better, for instance, and we'll make a lot more progress.
Yeah, we're shining new light on that verbiage, and
Right.
It is really, really neat to see. And I have absolutely loved getting to talk with you on this podcast, Dr. G, and thank you so much for coming on and sharing with
welcome.
us. And to all of our listeners and viewers, thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode of the Creation Podcast. If you would like to learn more about ICR's new theory of biological design, be sure to check out Dr. G's Acts and Facts articles on ICR.org. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like, subscribe, and share this podcast with your friends, because we really want to be able to get the creation message out to as many people as possible. If you would like to receive the Creation Podcast a week early, or our monthly podcast, Creation.live, 2 weeks early, you can click the link in the description to become a member on YouTube or Patreon. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
We want to say a huge thank you to our members and patrons. If you'd like to see your name here and unlock perks like early access to our podcasts, members-only polls and live streams, behind-the-scenes footage, or exclusive video content, links are in the description below.